From as far back as I can remember, Liam was the golden child. It wasn't something he earned or even asked for, it was simply bestowed upon him by our mother, Margaret, as if it were his birthright. There was no formal declaration of his favored status, but it didn't need to be spoken. It was in the way she cooked his meals just the way he liked them, ironed his clothes without ever asking, and defended him fiercely, even when he was clearly in the wrong. I was never resentful of his place in her heart, not at first. If anything, I prided myself on being independent. While Liam needed her to wake him up for school, pack his lunch, and remind him of his assignments, I had learned early on to take care of myself. I didn't mind doing my own laundry or preparing my own breakfast. It felt good to be self-sufficient, to not need anyone in the way Liam seemed to need everyone. I thought this made me stronger, more resilient. But as we grew older, that sense of strength began to feel like isolation. Liam wasn't just the favorite. He was the loud, vibrant centerpiece of the family, while I was the quiet shadow that fell around the edges. I wasn't jealous, how could I be, when Liam's personality seemed to demand attention? But there was an unspoken understanding that he came first in every situation. If there was a disagreement, Margaret would almost always side with him. If he needed help with homework, I was expected to tutor him because, as she often said, family takes care of each other. Liam didn't see this as an act of kindness on my part. To him, my help was owed, a duty I could not escape. He took what was offered without so much as a thank you and gave nothing in return. It wasn't long before he began testing the boundaries of what he could take, not just from me, but from everyone around him. At first it was harmless teasing. For eyes, he would call me when I wore my glasses. He mocked my interest in books and my tendency to spend hours alone in my room, labeling me a nerd. But over time the teasing turned cruel. He would share my private thoughts, stolen from the pages of my journal, with anyone who would listen. When I complained to our mother, her response was always the same. He's just playing. That's what brothers do. I wanted to believe her, to think that maybe this was normal, that perhaps I was too sensitive. But there were moments when Liam's actions crossed a line so clearly that even Margaret couldn't excuse them. Like the time he tried to set my hair on fire. He laughed as I screamed, claiming it was just a joke, but the singed strands of my hair told a different story. Even then, Margaret defended him, saying he didn't mean any harm. It was our father, Robert, who finally stepped in and put a stop to it. "You don't play with fire," he had said, his voice steady and firm. "Not in this house, and not at your brother's expense." For the first time, Liam looked genuinely startled. Our father rarely intervened, choosing instead to let Margaret handle most of the parenting. But when he did, his words carried weight. That day, Liam learned there were limits, though he never apologized. By the time I reached high school, my relationship with Liam had deteriorated into a quiet animosity. He ignored me when he wasn't insulting me, and I did my best to avoid him altogether. Margaret tried to downplay the tension, dismissing it as a phase we would outgrow, but I knew better. Liam didn't hate me because of anything I had done. He hated me because I existed as a contrast to him, quiet where he was loud, responsible where he was reckless, unnoticed where he demanded attention. I often wondered what might have been different if Margaret had treated us equally. Would Liam have still resented me? Would I have grown up feeling less like an afterthought? These were questions I couldn't answer, and after a while I stopped asking. The answers didn't matter. What mattered was that I would eventually leave this house, this family, and carve out a life where Liam and his shadow didn't loom so large over me. Until then, I endured. I found solace in my studies, in the predictability of books and equations, where the rules were clear and unchanging. In the quiet of my room, I imagined a future where I was free of Liam's taunts and Margaret's dismissiveness. It was a small comfort, but it was enough to keep me going. Looking back now, I realize that those years taught me a great deal, not just about resilience, but about the quiet strength that comes from enduring what feels unbearable. Liam may have been the golden child, but in those moments of quiet resolve, I found something far more valuable. A sense of self that no amount of favoritism could take away. Leaving home was not a dramatic escape. It wasn't marked by slammed doors or shouted goodbyes. Instead, it was a quiet, inevitable departure, as though I'd simply slipped out of a life I no longer belonged to. The day I left for college, my father shook my hand, my mother offered a quick hug, and Liam barely looked up from his phone. It was fitting in a way, That my exit from the Parker household was as understated as my presence within it had always been. College was a revelation. For the first time, I wasn't Ethan Parker, the quiet, dependable older brother or the overlooked son. I was just Ethan, and that anonymity felt like freedom. The campus was alive with possibility, a place where I could reinvent myself or perhaps discover who I had been all along. In my second year, I met Clara. It wasn't the kind of meeting you see in movies, where two people lock eyes across a crowded room and the world fades away. It was ordinary, almost forgettable. A mutual friend introduced us at a party, and we spent the evening talking about everything and nothing. She had a way of listening that made you feel like the only person in the room, even when the music was loud and the conversations around us were chaotic. Clara was different from anyone I had known. She was confident but not overbearing, thoughtful but not overly serious. There was a warmth to her that drew people in. A quality I couldn't quite name but found myself captivated by. Over the months that followed, we grew closer, our friendship evolving into something more. By the time we graduated, we were inseparable. When Clara told me she was pregnant, I was stunned. We were young, just starting our lives, and the future felt uncertain. But there was never a moment of hesitation in my mind. I loved her and I wanted to build a life with her. We married in a small ceremony, surrounded by close friends and family. Even Liam was there, standing off to the side with his usual detached air. For a brief moment, I thought he looked genuinely happy for me, but the thought was fleeting. Life as a newlywed and a new father was challenging but fulfilling. Clara and I settled into a routine, balancing our jobs with the demands of raising Noah, our son. I took pride in being the kind of husband and father my own had been: steady, reliable, and present. For a time, it felt like everything was finally falling into place. But life has a way of unsettling even the most carefully built foundations. It was subtle at first, the way Clara began to distance herself. She worked late more often, her laughter less frequent, her silences longer. I told myself it was just the stress of balancing work and motherhood, that it was nothing to worry about. But the unease lingered, a quiet presence in the background of our lives. It was during the holidays that things began to shift. Clara suggested we spend Thanksgiving with my family, a proposal that surprised me. She had always been polite to my parents, but I wouldn't have described her as eager to spend extended time with them. Still, I agreed, thinking perhaps she wanted to build stronger connections with them. At first, the visit went well. My father enjoyed holding Noah, his laughter filling the room in a way I hadn't heard in years. My mother doted on Clara, thrilled to have another woman in the house. Even Liam seemed to warm up to her, engaging in conversations and cracking jokes that made her smile. I should have been relieved, happy even, to see my family coming together. Instead, I felt a vague discomfort, as though I were watching a play where the actors had forgotten their lines but kept performing anyway. Clara and Liam began to spend more time together, playing video games in the evenings or chatting in the kitchen, while my mother prepared meals. I told myself it was a good thing. After all, Liam and I had always been distant, and if Clara could bridge that gap, wasn't that a positive change? Still, something about their interactions nagged at me, not because they were overtly inappropriate but because they felt intentional. When the holidays ended and Clara and I returned home, life seemed to return to normal. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and though I tried to ignore it, it began to grow, its roots spreading quietly, unseen. There were moments when I caught her looking at her phone with a faint smile or laughing at something she wouldn't explain. I didn't press her for answers, convincing myself that trust was the cornerstone of our marriage. But trust, I would later learn, is fragile. And when it breaks, it does so not in an instant, but in countless small moments: the missed glances, the unanswered questions, the silences that speak louder than words. Looking back, I realized that the cracks in our marriage didn't appear overnight. They had been there all along, hidden beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. And when they did, they would shatter everything I thought I knew about love, family, and loyalty. For now, though, I was still in the dark, blissfully unaware of the storm that was quietly brewing around me. Marriage is rarely what we expect it to be. In its quietest moments, it can feel like a warm refuge, a place of comfort and understanding. But it can also be a mirror, reflecting truths we might prefer to ignore. For a time, I thought Clara and I had built something unshakable. We had our son, Noah, our routines, and a shared vision for the future. It felt steady, secure. But security is a delicate thing, and even the smallest cracks can weaken the foundation. The first crack appeared in the form of a late-night phone call. Clara had been working longer hours, which I attributed to her growing responsibilities at work. One evening, as I cleaned up after dinner, her phone buzzed on the counter. A name I didn't recognize flashed on the screen, accompanied by a message that seemed unusually familiar for a colleague. I didn't read it. I told myself I had no reason to. Clara and I had built our marriage on trust, and I was determined to honor that. But the doubt had been planted, subtle and insidious. Over the following weeks, I noticed more late nights, more excuses about meetings and deadlines. The laughter that had once filled our home felt muted, replaced by a strange tension I couldn't quite place. It wasn't until a chance encounter with one of Clara's co-workers at a local coffee shop that the pieces began to fall into place. We exchanged polite greetings, and I mentioned how proud I was of Clara's dedication to her job. The co-worker smiled awkwardly, his eyes darting away. "Yeah, she's been working hard," he said. But there was something in his tone and unease that set my nerves on edge. That evening I asked Clara about her work. I kept my tone light, curious, not accusatory. She answered quickly, her words measured but not defensive. Yet there was something missing, a warmth, a familiarity that had once been there. I told myself I was overthinking it, that my own insecurities were creating shadows where none existed. Then came the second crack. It was a Sunday afternoon, and Clara had taken Noah to the park while I stayed home to catch up on some work. As I tidied the living room, I found a receipt tucked under one of the couch cushions. It was from a restaurant I didn't recognize, dated on a night when Clara had told me she was working late. I stared at the slip of paper, my mind racing through explanations. Could have been a business dinner, I thought. There was no reason to assume otherwise. But assumptions, I've learned, are often the lies we tell ourselves to avoid confronting the truth. When I finally confronted Clara, it wasn't in anger. I waited until Noah was asleep, the house quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. I showed her the receipt, my voice calm, and asked her to explain. She didn't deny it. Instead, she sat across from me, her hands folded in her lap, and told me everything. She spoke in a tone I couldn't quite place, not defensive, not remorseful but detached, as though recounting a story that happened to someone else. The affair, she said, had been brief, a mistake born of loneliness and poor judgment. It had ended months ago, and she insisted it meant nothing. "It was never about you," she said, as if that would make it easier to bear. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that this was a mistake we could overcome, that the life we had built was worth fighting for. But trust, once broken, is not so easily repaired. It wasn't just the affair itself that hurt. It was the realization that the woman I thought I knew, the woman I had built my life around, was capable of such a betrayal. I told Claire I needed time to think. She nodded, her expression unreadable, and left me alone in the quiet of our living room. That night, as I lay awake in the dark, I replayed her words in my mind, searching for answers, for clarity. But all I found was the growing sense that the cracks in our marriage were deeper than I had ever imagined. In the days that followed, we tried to move forward. Clara promised it would never happen again, and I tried to believe her. For Noah's sake, I told myself we could rebuild, that forgiveness was possible. But the doubt lingered, an invisible weight pressing down on every conversation, every shared glance. Looking back, I realize now that the affair was only a symptom of a deeper problem, one we had both ignored for too long. The cracks in our marriage had been there from the beginning, hidden beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. And when they did, they didn't just weaken the foundation, they shattered it. But at the time, I still believed in the possibility of repair. I didn't know that the worst was yet to come. The truth has a way of creeping into your life, not with a loud knock but as a soft, persistent whisper. It sits in the corner of your mind, patiently waiting until you can no longer ignore it. That was how I felt in the days after Clara's confession. I wanted to believe we could move past her infidelity, that it was a singular lapse in judgment rather than a reflection of something deeper. But the unease lingered, a quiet reminder that not everything had been said. It was during a conversation with Clara one evening, as we sat in the kitchen after putting Noah to bed, that the whisper grew louder. She was quiet, stirring her tea absent-mindedly, her gaze fixed on some point far beyond the room. I asked her if there was anything else she needed to tell me. My tone was calm, almost casual, but the weight of the question hung heavy in the air. She hesitated, her spoon clinking against the side of the mug. "There's something I've been meaning to tell you," she said finally, her voice soft. "About Noah." The moment stretched between us, taut and fragile, as though the wrong word might shatter it entirely. "What about him?" I asked, keeping my tone steady. Clara looked down at her tea, her hands trembling slightly. "I'm not sure if he's yours." The words landed like a stone in the still water of my mind, sending ripples of disbelief and confusion outward. I stared at her, unable to speak, unable to process what she had just said. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. "What do you mean?" I managed to ask, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. She explained, haltingly at first, how she and Liam had grown closer during the holidays when we stayed with my family. "It wasn't planned," she said, as though that made it better. "We were both in a bad place, and it just happened." Her words blurred together as I tried to piece them into something coherent, something I could understand. Liam. Of all the people in the world, it had to be him. My brother, the one person who had made my life a living hell growing up, had now inserted himself into the one part of my life I thought was safe. Clara's voice broke through my thoughts. "I didn't know how to tell you," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I thought if I stayed with you, if I chose you, it wouldn't matter." Wouldn't matter. The words echoed in my mind, their meaning both absurd and devastating. She had made a choice, yes, but it wasn't just about her or me. It was about Noah, the boy I had loved and raised as my own. How could something like that not matter? I left the house that night, needing space to think. I drove aimlessly for hours, the streets blurring together as my thoughts raced. When I finally returned home, Clara was waiting in the living room, her eyes red and puffy. She asked if we could talk, but I told her I needed time. Time to figure out what this revelation meant for me, for us, for Noah. The next day, I went to my parents' house. My father, Robert, greeted me with his usual reserved warmth, while my mother, Margaret, fussed over my appearance, asking if I'd been eating enough. It was all so normal, so routine that I almost forgot why I had come. Over dinner, I told them everything. Clara's affair, the uncertainty about Noah, and most painfully of all, the involvement of Liam. My father's expression darkened as I spoke, his usual calm replaced by a rare and simmering anger. My mother, on the other hand, seemed torn, her loyalty to Liam warring with her disappointment. When I finished, the room fell into a heavy silence. My father was the first to speak. "Liam needs to answer for this," he said, his voice steady but firm. "This isn't just about you, Ethan. This is about our family." My mother predictably tried to defend Liam. "He's young," she said, as though that excused his behavior. "People make mistakes." "This isn't a mistake, Margaret," my father said, cutting her off. "This is a betrayal. Of Ethan, of his marriage, of this family." It was decided then and there that we would confront Liam. My father called him and asked him to come over the next day, without revealing why. When Liam arrived, his usual swagger faltered as he saw the expressions on our faces. My father asked him directly about his involvement with Clara. At first, he denied everything, his voice laced with indignation. But when I told him Clara had already confessed, his bravado crumbled. "She came to me," he said, his tone defensive. "It wasn't just me." "That doesn't make it right," my father replied, his voice heavy with disappointment. "You betrayed your brother. You betrayed us all." For the first time in my life, I saw Liam truly shaken. My father told him that he would no longer support him financially, that he would need to face the consequences of his actions. My mother protested, but my father's decision was final. As for me, I felt a strange mix of emotions: anger, sadness, relief. The truth was out, but it had come at a cost. My family, already fractured, felt irreparably broken. And yet, in the midst of it all, I felt a quiet strength rising within me. I had faced the truth, no matter how painful, and I would find a way to move forward. But as I drove home that night, the question lingered. What did forward even look like now? The day after the confrontation, I awoke to a strange kind of stillness. It wasn't the peaceful quiet that comes with resolution, but the heavy silence of something irrevocably broken. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering how to move forward. The truth was out now about Clara, about Liam, about Noah. But knowing the truth didn't feel like freedom. It felt like standing in the wreckage of a home that could never be rebuilt. Clara had left me several messages overnight. Each one was a variation of the same theme. Apologies mixed with pleas to meet, to talk, to work things out. I couldn't bring myself to respond. What was there to say? The foundation of our marriage was gone, replaced by a chasm too wide to bridge. Later that morning my father called. He wanted to check on me, but I could hear the tension in his voice. The events of the previous night had shaken him deeply. "Your mother and I have been talking," he said after a long pause, "about everything that's happened." "And?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. "She wants to forgive Liam," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "She thinks he's learned his lesson." I closed my eyes, taking a slow breath. Of course she did. Margaret had always been quick to excuse Liam's behavior, no matter how egregious. "And you?" I asked. "I can't," he said simply. "Not this time." It was the first time I had ever heard my father speak so definitively about Liam. He had always been the quieter parent, content to let my mother handle the discipline. But something about this betrayal had pushed him past his limits. "I've decided to change my will," he continued. "I'm leaving everything to you." I sat up, startled. "Dad, you don't have to. This isn't about money," he interrupted. "It's about accountability. Liam has to face the consequences of his actions, and I won't reward him for what he's done." I didn't know how to respond. The inheritance, substantial as it was, felt like a weight rather than a gift. But I understood my father's decision. For him, this was about drawing a line, about protecting what little remained of our family's integrity. That evening I finally called Clara. We agreed to meet at a neutral location, a small park near our house where we had taken Noah countless times. She arrived first, sitting on a bench with her hands folded in her lap. When she saw me, her face lit up with a fleeting hope that faded as she registered my expression. "I'm sorry," she said as I sat down. "For everything." "I know," I replied, my voice calm but distant. "But it doesn't change what happened." She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. For a moment we sat in silence, the sounds of children playing in the distance filling the space between us. Finally she spoke. "What happens now?" I looked at her, searching for the right words. "We move on," I said simply. "Separately." Her face crumpled, but she didn't argue. I think she knew deep down that there was no other option. We discussed the logistics, how to tell Noah, how to divide our assets, how to navigate the fragile future that lay ahead. It was a conversation filled with practicality, devoid of the emotion that had once defined our relationship. When I returned home, I began packing my belongings. I didn't tell Clara where I was going, and she didn't ask. It was better this way, I thought. Cleaner. But as I folded my clothes and gathered my books, I felt a pang of sadness for the life I was leaving behind. It wasn't just Clara or Noah or the house itself. It was the hope I had carried into this marriage, the belief that love could weather anything. Before leaving, I paused in the doorway of Noah's room. He was asleep, his small chest rising and falling with the steady rhythm of dreams. For a moment I considered waking him, holding him, telling him everything would be okay. But I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I closed the door quietly behind me and walked away. The next few weeks were a blur of legal documents and difficult conversations. The divorce proceedings were straightforward, thanks in part to Clara's admission of infidelity. But the custody discussions were more complicated. Clara wanted me to remain a part of Noah's life, arguing that he shouldn't lose the only father he had ever known. I wasn't so sure. How could I be a father to a child who wasn't mine? A child who was the living reminder of everything I had lost. The final blow came with the paternity test. Seeing the results in black and white felt like a second betrayal, even though I had already known the truth. Noah was Liam's son. I stared at the paper, the words blurring together as tears filled my eyes. It wasn't just the loss of fatherhood, it was the realization that Liam, in his selfishness, had taken something from me that I could never get back. When the divorce was finalized, I felt a strange mixture of relief and grief. The life I had built, the family I had fought to protect, was gone. But in its place was a chance to start over, to rebuild something new. I didn't know what that would look like yet, But for the first time in a long while, I felt the faint stirrings of hope. I moved into a small apartment on the edge of town, far enough from the life I had left behind but close enough to remain in contact with my parents. I started going to therapy, not because I wanted to dwell on the past but because I needed to understand it. To understand myself. As for Liam, he tried to reach out, leaving voicemails and sending messages that I never responded to. My father stood firm in his decision, cutting off financial support and making it clear that Liam was no longer welcome in the family. My mother struggled with this, of course, but even she seemed to recognize that some bridges couldn't be rebuilt. And so we all moved forward in our own ways separately, but forever marked by what had happened. The cracks in our family might never heal, but perhaps in time we could learn to live with them. Life after the divorce felt like walking through a field of broken glass. Every step was cautious, deliberate, and tinged with the awareness that no matter how careful I was, the pain would linger. I moved into a modest apartment on the other side of town, a space that was small but quiet, a blank slate on which to rebuild my life. The days settled into a rhythm of work, therapy sessions, and solitary evenings. I found solace in the routine, though the silence of my new home was often oppressive. It was a stark contrast to the life I had shared with Clara and Noah, a life that had been filled with the sounds of laughter, arguments, and the gentle chaos of family. Now, the only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator or the occasional creak of the floorboards. I avoided places that reminded me of them: the park where Noah had learned to ride his bike, the cafe where Clara and I used to linger over coffee on lazy Sunday mornings. Even the grocery store felt like a minefield, each aisle holding the potential to trigger a memory I wasn't ready to confront. Instead, I kept my world small, focusing on the essentials and leaving little room for anything else. My father, Robert, called often, checking in on me with a quiet concern that I hadn't noticed before. He never pressed for details or offered unsolicited advice, but his presence was steady, a reminder that I wasn't entirely alone. My mother, Margaret, was more conflicted. While she supported me outwardly, I could sense her internal struggle. Liam was still her son, after all, and no matter how much she tried to hide it, her maternal instincts pulled her toward him. One evening, my father invited me over for dinner. It was a simple affair: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans, but the conversation was heavier than the meal. As we sat in the dimly lit dining room, he spoke candidly about his decision to cut Liam off. "It wasn't easy," he said, his voice low, "but it had to be done. He needs to understand that actions have consequences." I nodded, though I wasn't sure I agreed. Liam had always lived without consequences, shielded by my mother's unwavering support. Would this time be any different? Would he truly learn, or would he find someone else to blame as he always had? "Your mother struggles with it," my father continued, as though reading my thoughts. "But I told her that if she reaches out to him, I'll have no choice but to reconsider our marriage." His words startled me, not because of their harshness but because of the resolve behind them. My father had always been a quiet man, one who preferred compromise to confrontation. But this situation had pushed him beyond his limits, and he was no longer willing to tolerate the fractures Liam had caused. "Do you think he regrets it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. My father shook his head slowly. "I don't know. But regret isn't enough. He has to take responsibility." Responsibility. It was a concept Liam had never fully grasped, and I wasn't sure he ever would. But as much as I wanted to write him off, to dismiss him as a lost cause, a part of me couldn't help but wonder, what would it take for him to truly change? Was it even possible? In the weeks that followed, I heard bits and pieces about Liam through mutual acquaintances and extended family. He had dropped out of college, unable to afford the tuition without my father's support. He was working part-time as a mechanic and living with Clara, raising Noah together in a rented house on the outskirts of town. The thought of them as a family that should have been mine, stung more than I cared to admit. Clara reached out once, leaving a voicemail that I couldn't bring myself to listen to. She said she wanted to talk about Noah, to discuss what role I might still play in his life. But I didn't respond. It wasn't that I didn't care about Noah, I did. But every time I thought about seeing him, I saw Liam's face. The resemblance was undeniable, a painful reminder of the betrayal that had upended my life. Therapy helped, though it was a slow and often uncomfortable process. My therapist, a patient woman named Dr. Harris, encouraged me to confront my feelings rather than suppress them. Grief isn't linear, she said during one session. It's messy, unpredictable. But avoiding it won't make it go away. She was right, of course, but knowing that didn't make it any easier. I wrestled with conflicting emotions: anger at Liam, disappointment in Clara, and a deep, aching sadness for the family I had lost. There were moments when the weight of it all felt unbearable. But there were also glimmers of hope, small signs that healing was possible. One such moment came during a visit to my parents' house. My father and I had started a tradition of playing golf on Saturday mornings, a ritual that was more about the companionship than the game itself. Afterward, we would sit on the porch with cups of coffee, talking about everything and nothing. It was during one of these conversations that he said something that stayed with me. "You've been through hell, Ethan," he said, his gaze steady. "But you're still here. And that means something." I nodded, unsure of how to respond. His words were simple, but they carried a weight that resonated deeply. I was still here. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. As the months passed, the shattered ties of my life began to take new shapes. They weren't the same, and they never would be. But in their place was something different, a quiet strength, a resilience I hadn't known I possessed. And though the road ahead was still uncertain, I found comfort in the small steps I was taking, one day at a time. By the time spring arrived, the sharp edges of my grief had dulled into something softer, though no less present. Life had found a new rhythm, one marked by solitude but not loneliness. My days were filled with work, therapy, and the occasional golf game with my father. It wasn't a life I had planned, but it was a life I was learning to live. I hadn't spoken to Liam since the confrontation at my parents' house. Any news of him came secondhand through extended family, or the occasional slip from my mother. It seemed he and Clara were making a life together, though not without struggle. The thought of them as a couple raising Noah, building a home, still twisted something deep inside me, but I had learned to push it aside. Dwelling on it served no purpose. One evening, as I sat on my apartment balcony watching the sun dip below the horizon, my phone buzzed. It was a number I didn't recognize, but something told me to answer. On the other end of the line was Liam. "Ethan," he began, his voice quieter than I had ever heard it. I need to talk to you." There was a long pause as I considered hanging up. But curiosity, or perhaps something deeper, kept me on the line. "What do you want, Liam?" He sighed heavily. "I know I'm the last person you want to hear from, but I needed to say I'm sorry. For everything." His words hung in the air, tentative and unsteady. For a moment, I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to unleash all the anger I had carried, to make him feel the weight of what he had done. But another part of me, a quieter, more tired part, simply wanted to move on. "I don't know if sorry is enough," I said finally, my tone measured. "I know," he admitted. "I've made a mess of everything. I've hurt you, I've hurt Clara and Noah. I can't fix it, but I want to at least try to make things right." I let his words settle. They sounded sincere, but sincerity wasn't the same as trust. "What does making it right look like to you, Liam?" "I don't know," he said after a long pause. "I just thought you deserved to hear it from me." The conversation ended shortly after, neither of us sure where to go from there. I sat with the phone in my lap, staring at the screen as though it might offer answers. The apology felt like a step forward, but it was only a step. The bridge between us had been burned to ash, and rebuilding it would take more than words. In the days that followed, I found myself thinking about forgiveness. Not the kind that absolves someone of their actions, but the kind that frees you from carrying their weight. My therapist had often spoken of it as a gift you give yourself, a way to let go of anger and make room for something else. But forgiving Liam felt like an impossible task, one I wasn't sure I was ready to undertake. My father's reaction to Liam's apology was unsurprising. "Words are easy," he said when I told him about the call. "What matters is what he does next." My mother, on the other hand, was more conflicted. She was relieved to hear that Liam had reached out, seeing it as a sign of growth. "He's trying, Ethan," she said, her voice laced with hope. "Isn't that worth something?" I didn't have an answer for her. Liam's apology might have been sincere, but sincerity didn't undo the damage. And yet, as much as I wanted to shut him out, a small part of me wondered if it was possible to find some semblance of peace, not for him, but for myself. As spring gave way to summer, I took small steps toward rebuilding my own life. I reconnected with old friends, started volunteering at a local community center, and even entertained the idea of dating again. It was slow, tentative progress, but it was progress nonetheless. One day, as I walked through the park near my apartment, I spotted Clara sitting on a bench with Noah. She didn't see me at first, her attention focused on Noah as he played with a toy truck. I considered walking away, avoiding the encounter altogether, but something stopped me. "Clara," I said, approaching cautiously. She looked up, startled at first, but her expression softened when she saw me. "Ethan," she said quietly. "Hi." We stood in silence for a moment, the weight of our shared history hanging between us. Finally she spoke. "I didn't expect to see you here." "I didn't expect to stop," I admitted. "But I thought maybe we should talk." Her eyes filled with a mix of relief and uncertainty. "I'd like that." We sat on the bench watching Noah play as we talked. The conversation was stilted at first, but gradually, the walls began to come down. We spoke about Noah, about the challenges she and Liam were facing, and about the ways our lives had changed since the divorce. It wasn't an easy conversation, but it was an honest one. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, I realized that this was the first time I had felt a sense of closure. Clara and I would never be what we once were. But perhaps we could find a way to coexist not as enemies, but as people who had shared something profound, however fleeting. When we parted ways, she thanked me for stopping. I nodded, unsure of what to say. As I walked away, I glanced back at Noah, who was now chasing a butterfly across the grass. For the first time in a long while, I smiled, not because everything was okay, but because it felt like it might be someday. Time doesn't heal all wounds, but it has a way of dulling their sharpness. As the months turned into a year, I found myself less consumed by what had happened and more focused on what lay ahead. The past hadn't disappeared, it lingered in the quiet moments, in the spaces where anger and grief had once lived. But those spaces were smaller now, less defining. My relationship with my parents had settled into a new rhythm. My father and I continued our Saturday golf games, a ritual that had become less about the sport and more about the companionship. My mother, though still quietly torn, seemed to accept the boundaries my father and I had set regarding Liam. She didn't mention him often, and when she did, it was with a careful neutrality that suggested she was still navigating her own conflicted feelings. Liam, for his part, stayed out of my life. After his apology, I heard little from him directly, though occasional updates filtered through extended family. He was still working as a mechanic, still raising Noah with Clara. From what I gathered, their life was far from easy, but they were managing. I didn't wish them ill, but I also didn't wish to be a part of their story. Forgiveness, I had realized, didn't mean reconciliation. It meant letting go, and I was learning how to do that in my own time. One evening, as I sat on my balcony watching the city lights flicker in the distance, I thought about Noah. I had avoided contact with him since the divorce, not because I didn't care, but because I didn't know how to bridge the gap between what he was to me and what he represented. He wasn't my son, not biologically at least, but for years I had loved him as though he were. That love hadn't vanished, but it had become tangled in the complexities of everything that had happened. It was my therapist who finally helped me untangle it. "You can love Noah without being his father," she said during one session. "Love doesn't have to fit into a specific role or expectation. It can simply be." Her words stayed with me, and one day I found myself writing a letter to Noah. It wasn't long, just a few paragraphs letting him know that I cared about him, that I was proud of him, and that I hoped he was happy. I didn't mention Liam or Clara or the circumstances that had led to my absence. It wasn't about them. It was about him. I mailed the letter without expecting a response, but a few weeks later, Clara reached out. She told me that Noah had been thrilled to hear from me, that he still talked about the times we'd spent together, and asked if we could see each other again. Her voice was cautious, almost hesitant, as though she didn't want to push me but hoped I might say yes. And I did. The first meeting was awkward. Noah was shy at first, unsure of how to navigate this new version of our relationship. But as the afternoon wore on, the walls began to come down. We played catch in the park, shared ice cream at a nearby cafe, and talked about his favorite books and games. It was simple, unremarkable even, but it felt like a step towards something meaningful. As I drove home that evening, I realized that reconnecting with Noah didn't feel like reopening an old wound. It felt like planting something new in the space where that wound had been something fragile but hopeful, something worth nurturing. In the months that followed, I continued to build a life that felt more like my own. I joined a book club, started hiking on weekends, and even attended a few art classes at the local community center. Each step felt small on its own, but together they created a sense of momentum, a feeling that I was moving forward, however slowly. I thought about Liam less often, though when I did, it was with a mix of emotions: anger, sadness, pity. I didn't know if he had truly changed, and I wasn't sure it mattered. He was part of my story, but he no longer defined it. That realization felt like freedom. One afternoon, as I walked along a quiet trail outside the city, I paused to take in the view. The sun was low on the horizon, casting a warm golden light over the hills. For the first time in what felt like years, I allowed myself to feel a sense of peace. It wasn't the peace of forgetting or erasing the past, but the peace of accepting it, of understanding that life is rarely as neat or as simple as we wish it to be. Moving forward didn't mean leaving everything behind. It meant carrying the parts that mattered, the parts that made me who I was, and letting the rest fall away. And as I stood there watching the sun dip below the horizon, I felt ready to take the next step, whatever it might be.